You want to know what it's like to play the Lonesome Road DLC?
Courier, I didn't know you would show up so soon. If I did, I would have done my braids up for you. Not because I want to look good for you or anything. You're only the cutest white boy in the Mojave. I mean, the coolest white boy in the Mojave. That's right. I know all about you. Not as a stalker, of course. Just think of me as your secret admirer, teehee. I even know you survived getting shot. Well, it's to be expected. You're just so strong and handsome and smart, and I wish you liked me. I mean, I love you. I'd love to be like you. By the way, I saw you with that girl, Veronica. Is she your girlfriend? She's ugly. Never bring her here.
I am not a fan of the Lonesome Road DLC, which is hardly lonesome since Ulysses, its main antagonist, is yapping in your ear through the whole ordeal. I thought Joshua Graham was the Mormon. Why is Ulysses the one compelling me to hear about his worldview, and worse, hijacking my Eddie to do it? You'd think that, with technology this advanced, there'd be a volume knob somewhere on this thing, to shut him up for good. It's not just me either. A lot of other New Vegas fans hate it as well and see Ulysses as a pretentious sude peddling too deep for you Reddit poli-sci. But what if we're wrong? What if it really is deep? And we're confusing a complicated character for a poorly written one? It's not. We're right. I went through all of his dialogue to try and weave a cohesive narrative or establish a consistent personality, and it can't be done. This isn't a fluke either. New Vegas fans will lock in for 8-hour binges of straight lore dumping. If we can't stand Ulysses, trust me, it's not because we don't get it or that it's more convoluted than we can handle. It's because he sucks. And after all, there is the option to kill Ulysses and nuke both the NCR and the Legion at the end to make it worth your while. Now, if you have played it and you do like it, please watch the video and tell me if I'm wrong. It all starts with Ulysses' backstory, which, admittedly, there's a lot about it that I like, but certain things just don't add up. You see, Ulysses was originally a member of the Twisted Hares tribe, who helped out the Legion in conquering and destroying other tribes, Ulysses being one of their best scouts. But in return, the Legion betrayed them, Woolpace and Kulta specifically. They were conquered just like the rest, their cultures oppressed, and any who resisted were crucified. In spite of this, Ulysses remained loyal to the Legion, becoming a Frumentarius. He was actually the one to inform Caesar about the NCR and Hoover Dam, starting the infamous war between Bear and Bull. He works as a courier in his duties as a Frumentarius. Caesar gives him the rule to kill no courier because other couriers could also be undercover Legion. Along the way, he somehow hears about you, Courier 6. You were working for the NCR apparently, whether you like it or not, which is annoying, but we'll get to that later. You are the reason the NCR discovered the Divide, a burgeoning independent community, and when they did, so did the Legion. Ulysses witnesses you making one last delivery to the Divide for the NCR. You leave, unbeknownst to him. The contents of the package activate the missile silos underneath the Divide, destroying it completely, along with all the NCR and Legion soldiers stationed there. Ulysses almost dies in the explosion, but gets saved by some medical iBots that recognize the pre-war American flag on the back of his jacket. Seeing this community that promised a real alternative to the Legion get destroyed like that affected him deeply, but he figures you died and keeps going about his business. His next job for Caesar is to rally the Whitelegs against the New Canaanites. He was the one that armed them and taught them Legion values.
If New Canaan burns, Caesar might see them. Might. Even the chance was a lie. To honor Caesar, destroy the history of New Canaan and the way they carry it in their generations and family. Caesar respects such strength, I told them. That was truth, even if strength wasn't the word. Obedience. You must be willing to kill anyone. Children, mothers, the weak, elders. If these New Canaanites value the generations, that is what you must kill. It was like Woolpace was speaking through me. Use the night, silence, and fire to change their words to please, to screams. No need for bombs when hate will do.
In an attempt to respect him, the Whitelegs started braiding their hair like Ulysses, which Ulysses found insulting because they didn't understand what the braids meant. Each one had some kind of significance, like language, but since the Whitelegs were oblivious, they were just braiding nonsense, which enrages Ulysses as he searches for a meaning in the braids that simply isn't there. Ulysses finally finishes his service to the Legion and travels the wastes, even becoming a bighorner rancher at one point. But he must have still been possessed after all this time by the idea of doing something big in the Mojave, learning from the Courier's destruction of the Divide that one person can make or break a nation, because he eventually makes his way to the Big Empty. He uses the X-17 station to get the location of the Divide's biggest remaining missile silo. He points Elijah in the direction of the Sierra Madre, causing the exact kind of inadvertent trouble he accuses you of, and talks to Christine, which convinces him that the Brotherhood of Steel is not the solution he's looking for. In a discussion with the think tank, he manages to briefly reawaken their memories of America, and they tell him about the intact missile silos in the Divide and how to activate them.
They told me what lies in the heart of the Divide, what can be found there, and the words to awaken it, and the one to speak them.
Which brings us to the last stop in Ulysses' history. Instead of immediately going to the Divide to carry out his plan, he decides to make a delivery for the Mojave Express of all things, so he can conveniently discover that you're actually still alive and delay his nuking plan until you're ready to come talk to him. He was supposed to carry the platinum chip, but when he saw your name on the list, he turned down the delivery and let you take it instead, in an attempt to get you killed without having to kill you directly, still holding the Kaiser's rule of kill no courier, even though why the hell would he care at this point? At some point, he must have realized that you weren't dead or the Mojave wouldn't kill you, and decides to try to lure you out to the Divide by broadcasting a simple message. Courier 6 Ulysses. Which brings us to the DLC itself. While the issues with Ulysses' character are interesting in and of themselves, there are also glaring problems with the setup for the DLC. For example, the package that Courier 6 delivered to the Divide that prompted it to blow up. What actually was it? There's no way it's just a device that triggers all missiles once it comes within range of them, right? That would be an extremely irresponsible and pointless way to design it. I've seen people speculate that it was a nuclear football, a device that actually existed in real life and was carried by US presidents. However, the nuclear football doesn't work like that. It's just a regular communication device that allows the president to communicate with people in command centers who can actually launch the bombs. That makes sense because it allows for a remote launch. But what does this supposed device accomplish? What is the purpose of a device that automatically launches all nukes once it can Bluetooth pair with the silo, which it does automatically as soon as you get them near one another? Fortunately, Chris Avallone, project director on Lonesome Road, clarified the matter. The NCR sacks Navarro in the West, recovers a bunch of tech they don't understand, as history has proven. They do, however, recognize the symbols, American flag, silo stencils, etc., and recognize it might be tied to the same symbols and markings the NCR found at the Divide. The NCR hires a courier to take the item there. They don't for a second think that anything bad will happen as a result, and neither does the player. The player delivers the package and leaves, but the package is a detonator that contains missile launch codes that just needs to get within range and start chatting with launch computers. So it does. So yeah, it basically does work like that. That's not the only issue here though. Ulysses saw the package being opened and knew what was in it, or it wasn't in a package at all, and saw it speak somehow. He saw it do whatever it did that triggered the explosion. Because if he didn't, how does he connect that the package you delivered is the thing that exploded the Divide? But if he did, how? It couldn't have been a situation where you delivered it and they opened it then and there and it triggered the nukes, because you managed to leave before it happened, and you had to be far enough away to where you didn't even hear it. Besides, whether the package opened or not, or whether it was in packaging at all, it just needs to get in range to activate. That part is irrelevant. You must have brought it to the threshold before it would have been in range, and Ulysses witnesses this. Many hours pass where it stays roughly in the same place so that you have time to get far enough away. Ulysses is still watching it because he's just that fascinated, and once you're gone, it gets brought within range. While technically possible, it's a stretch. But I'm not here to go all cinema sins on Avallone. I think the character issues are more pressing than any plot holes, and I probably wouldn't care about them if Ulysses were a stronger character, and he does come in here. For as much as he cares about the Divide to the point where he's willing to derail his own life indefinitely on its behalf, he has zero interest in figuring out whether its destruction was intentional in any way. He just pins it on you and calls it a day. Did the NCR know what they were doing when they ordered the delivery? Don't know and don't care. Him blaming you unreasonably, I guess you could chalk it up to him being your mentally mentally ill stalker, but well, we'll get to that later. Before we tackle the events of the DLC, let's touch on the setup for the Courier and how Lonesome Road suddenly assigns your character a backstory. If you've played this DLC, then you'll know that one of its defining features is it being a nagging simulator. Ulysses constantly whines at you for delivering the package that destroyed the Divide. On accident, and it wasn't even you, it was Courier 6, but you as the player didn't make that decision. What could be annoying about that? There are two types of RPGs in my mind. RPGs where you define who your character is and get to make choices in the story to reflect that, or RPGs where you're supposed to get into the role and mindset of a predefined character, where you don't have any choices, and it's more about getting immersed in a linear story. So this would be a game like, well, New Vegas versus Rockstar Games, or games from the Assassin's Creed franchise, for example. When you commit to one or the other, it makes your design goals very clear. The former is about agency, trying to provide the player with as many choices as possible to express themselves, to break the story, to break the game. The latter is about writing a great story, compelling characters, and immersing the player in it. They're forced to stay on the rails of your story, but you're offering a handcrafted, cinematic experience in exchange. Doing both at the same time, however, is very difficult, and I can't even think of an example of a game getting it right, to be quite honest. You're being pulled in two different directions at once. Up to this point in the story, the Courier's background has been left to the player's imagination. This whole time, they've been getting to decide for themselves what kind of person they are, and the world has been responding to the choices the player has made. Then all of a sudden, you've got this guy scolding you for stuff you did in the past, which you as the player didn't do. Your character did it before you were in control of them, and so it falls flat. Fallout 4's story was kinda rigged from the start for me for similar reasons. It hinges on you caring about your son who isn't the player's actual son. Now, that may sound silly at first because we care about game characters who aren't real people all the time, characters who have no real world connection to. But the point is that it takes time for you to care. Time spent in a linear, on-rails story where you wouldn't have any choices because the game needs you to build the connection with your son that it wants you to build. And well, that's just not gonna jibe with this kind of game. As it stands, Fallout 4's intro is just a dreadful burden that stands in the way of every perspective you play through. There's a massive disconnect between you and the pre-established character throughout the game, as opposed to base game New Vegas, which gets you out the door in like 5 minutes, and you don't need a reason to care about Benny shooting you because it's you, not someone else. What I'm saying is, this kind of game shouldn't force you into the constraints of its story. It's supposed to let you create your own. Ulysses lays the blame on even further when you launch the Ashton missile, which you're forced to do to progress the DLC, and it's used as further evidence against you to prove just how reckless you are. This is like if I threw a banana peel under your feet as you're walking, you slip and fall, and then I start monologuing like, of course, slipping and falling as always, can't even help yourself. What's really funny is that Ulysses is guilty of the same thing. Again, he managed to inadvertently set up death traps for you in the form of Elijah and the White Legs. Which brings me to another point. Chris Avallone never states that this was his intention, but a lot of Ulysses' dialogue gives off the vibe that the DLC is supposed to be a meta commentary of the player. As you trek through the Divide, he keeps telling you that you could leave at any point, but he knows that you won't because you just have to continue your journey. You're compelled to do it, and that even if you did leave, sooner or later he's sure you'd come back. He says you meddle just out of curiosity and restlessness. It really does feel like this is directed at the player, which is annoying because it's not a clever observation. You have no choice but to engage with the game in this way. The Divide delivery is also for the NCR, as I've said. Some people's couriers wouldn't ever make a delivery for the NCR. It kind of tramples on their agency as far as defining who their character is, betraying the design goals of this kind of game. But let's get into the actual events of the DLC. Following the coordinates in Ulysses' broadcast brings you to the Divide. Shortly after you enter, Ulysses makes contact with you through Eddie, an iBot you awakened.
There's your signal. Faint, but there. You came. Good. Curious, maybe.
In your first conversation, he starts hinting at the connection between you two, and what he wants, why he brought you here. Obviously, you as the player don't know about the Divide yet, the package you delivered, the lore we went over in the backstory segment. But this brings me to the other issue with assigning a backstory. Amnesia. Ulysses talks like you're very familiar with the Divide, or at least you should be. Many times he refers to it as your homeland, and says you were the one who breathed life into it.
I've been to your home. The place you kept returning to may not be the place you were born, or the place you gave life to. Same thing. Never would have known the Divide had it not been for you. The road you made with your tracks again and again. You journey to and from here. A hard road. Kept the land before the divide alive through seasons, storms. Can't have been just a job. Was something more to you. Don't feel for a place that hard unless it's home.
But you can ask Ulysses questions like, what is this place? What? Shouldn't you remember the divide? You could say that, look, maybe the courier isn't all there after getting shot in the head, and that could be a valid explanation. But Josh Sawyer, the lead designer on New Vegas, and Chris Avallone both stated that the courier does not have amnesia. So, what? As per Josh Sawyer, the courier is not an amnesiac. Questions about the NCR, Legion, local goings-on, etc. are present so the player does not stumble around without a clue. We can't assume any given player is familiar with these factions. So how on earth does the courier not remember going to the divide like all the time and single-handedly keeping it alive? But Avallone's quote is even more bizarre. The player does not have amnesia. The idea was that the package the player delivered was a standard fetch quest in New Vegas, one you might forget about, but the people you deliver it to don't. There are 100+ quests in the Mojave. People would be hard-pressed to remember all of them 3 to 5 years later, and the package that went to the divide was one of them. Yeah, but according to Ulysses, the package wasn't the only package you delivered to the divide, and in the DLC you act not only oblivious to the package, but to the divide altogether. Even if you weren't making deliveries specifically to the divide, instead just passing through it all the time, you would still be aware of its existence. So is Ulysses just mistaken or lying? That would be absurd and pointless from a narrative perspective. And as we'll get to later, Avallone said that Ulysses isn't crazy. So this is just a massive plot hole in my opinion. Also, the courier definitely should have heard about the catastrophe that happened there. I mean, what are the chances you make your last delivery there and coincidentally never bother trying to make another delivery there again, so you never find out it no longer exists? Though, to be honest, this is kind of an issue in the base game already. As Josh Sawyer stated in the quote before, the only reason they allow the player to ask questions the courier should already have the answers to is that the player needs to be clued in, even if that's a bit video game logic-y. But Lonesome Road retroactively exacerbates this problem, because the fact that the courier did a delivery for the NCR just makes it even more unbelievable for them not to know what the NCR is. Look, how hard would it have been to just give the courier amnesia, man? Looking back at Ulysses' dialogue is very strange once you know the full story. When you're first experiencing it, nothing seems wrong with him telling you all about the divide and the role you played in keeping it alive, because you, as the player, don't know anything about it. You're genuinely curious. But as we've already established, you as the courier should know, or at least he would think you would already know. From his perspective, you are traveling through the divide all the time. Why would he ever think to give you exposition about it? And he'll answer the "what is this place" question like it's a sensible one to ask. Or when you tell him this road leads nowhere, there's nothing in the divide, he'll say,
Many in the Mojave think the divide's nothing but canyon and storm. Wasn't always. There was life. A town farther west. Not talking about an old world town like Hopeville. More recent. Something you saw in your lifetime. It had the name, the divide, too. But rather than cracks in the earth, it was a road from the west into the Mojave, a supply line. Took a courier to make that road. You.
As far as I can tell, there's only one time he gets mad about having to remind you about your own homeland.
And you've forgotten. Forgotten everything. Careless. As careless with futures then as you are now in the Mojave.
And this is funny because obviously the courier is supposed to know, but how is the player supposed to know? Plus, his whole lure for bringing you here is that he has answers.
You came all this way for answers. Only currency I have. Nothing else to be gained. Could turn around, walk away at any time.
But these answers are either to questions the courier should already have the answer to, even if the player doesn't, or are answers to questions the courier just doesn't have, ones they wouldn't be aware of even. What is the divide? What happened to it? The courier should already know that. What is my connection to Ulysses? Well, prior to coming to the divide, you would have no idea who Ulysses even is. You never even heard that name. There'd be no reason for you to connect the dots to him being the courier who turned down the chip. Why would he count on you caring enough to learn more about him to come to the divide, when you've never even even heard his name. And he tells you that you
came for no other reason than you were curious, restless, always have been.
Like, bro, what are you talking about? How would you know that I'm curious or restless or that I always have been? Yeah, sure, he's meant to be your weirdo stalker, but it seems like the writing is trying to justify the idea that it would be reasonable for the courier to come here when really the only reason the player comes here is because they know they're supposed to play the DLC. His plan hinges on the assumption that you will come and meddle, that's just in your nature, but this entails a fourth wall breaking awareness of the player. He could have bothered to make his message a bit juicier than Courier 6 Ulysses if he's really dying to settle a score with you. For someone who's supposedly trying to lure you to your death with juicy information, he sure as hell isn't trying very hard. How does he even know with enough certainty that you're still alive to be willing to wait around in the divide for you indefinitely, but simultaneously can't track you down? He even knows all about your faction allegiance. It's actually one of the first things he remarks upon when you arrive in the divide, and no matter what it is, he'll whine at you for it.
Taking your chances coming here. Just like bringing the Lord of Vegas his tribute, bending your knee. You and that chip deserve each other. 29 less coins than other traitors have carried, if history's true. Like the rest of our brothers, blood in your eyes. Heard tales of you walk in the Mojave. Casting off your disguise, yet you carried that chip, determined to take it to Vegas. Not Geisar. You and that chip deserve each other. 29 fewer coins than other traders have carried. By history's mark. I hold Legion to be my brothers, even as misguided as they are. And you, more so than most. There's your signal. Faint, but there. Just like NCR. Voice without fire, without strength. Sick. There's your signal. Faint, but there. You came. Good. Curious, maybe. You walked the Mojave without a flag on your back. That'll end soon. Can't walk the long 15 and not have a nation's shadow fall on you. Maybe you just need to be tested, or you believe in nothing. We'll see.
What's brilliant is that even though this DLC set out to specifically make the most of the faction reputation mechanic, sometimes Ulysses will just straight up guess your allegiance wrong. This is because the game just looks at what your reputation is with each faction, and you can be idolized by multiple at the same time, rather than what quests you've actually completed. It really makes his words fall even flatter when he's nagging at you for supporting a faction that you don't even support. I don't blame people for thinking he's just actually canonically insane and made up the whole thing about you going to the divide as well. As is expected for Bethesda games, there's a mod to fix this bug, which came out just 4 days after Lonesome Road dropped. It was a pretty simple fix to just have him check whether you've killed Mr. House and which quests you've completed and failed. Then again, maybe it does make more sense for him to base his judgments solely on what you're famous for, what your reputation is around the Mojave. I mean, how would Ulysses have mystical supernatural knowledge of all the quests you've completed, including the ones that aren't public in nature? You're scheming behind the scenes and whatnot. But we know this wasn't an intentional design choice because you can't correct Ulysses if he makes the wrong guess about who you support, and even his judgments about the things you're famous for are broken. You can complete the House Always Wins 5 and fail Don't Tread on the Bear, and he'll still think you're NCR. It's kind of a cursed problem. Him having accurate knowledge of who you're siding with requires information he wouldn't reasonably have access to, but even the way it is in the game is kind of far-fetched. He supposedly couldn't kill you because he couldn't track you down, but somehow he's heard all this stuff about you. As he says, spent too many years looking for you, now letting you come to me. Are you just always one step ahead of him? You're traveling around pretty prominent places for the most part. It just feels contrived, what can I say? Wait. Ulysses is in the divide from the moment you start the game, October 19th, 2281. Because as soon as you leave Doc Mitchell's house, you receive his broadcast. So he's already camped out in the divide divide waiting for you. But everything you do for the factions is obviously after that point. So during that entire time, he's picking the cheese out from between his toes in some hellhole in the divide, muttering to himself about the bear and the bull. How the hell would he know anything about what's going on in the Mojave, much less the actions of a single courier? Okay, let's suppose he's tuning into the radio. Mr. New Vegas is not giving a play-by-play of every one of your movements, like he's not reading your diary live on air. He only mentions the courier specifically like twice. Most of your influence he reports on as general events or actions of an unknown person, where there's no hints or reason to assume that it's you, but Ulysses does not seem to be tuning into the radio anyways. After the DLC, if you spared his life, Ulysses will just be wistfully sitting on this cliff forever now. You can tell him various things, including the fact that you killed Mr. House, which he would already know about if he were following any kind of wasteland news source. Though that's quite a subtle detail which I doubt was intentional. Point is, the timeline here is screwed up. It's never even clarified whether he knows explicitly what the platinum chip actually is or does when he turns it down, because he seems to turn the delivery down in an attempt to get you killed, but when you press him on the subject, he just says he knows the Mojave would catch up to you eventually. Okay, but then why turn down the chip delivery in particular? I'm asking this because if Ulysses knows the chip is bad news, how? He says, there was death in that package, and the chip is important to old world ghosts, meaning Mr. House. How does he know this? The item in itself was innocuous, the delivery was ordered alongside other innocuous deliveries, and they were to be delivered to the strip, not directly to House as the client. The one smoking gun would be the fact that Victor, the Securitron, ordered the deliveries. Even so, supposing Ulysses knew this, and I'm not sure how he would, why did he take the job himself in the first place, if he knew it was full of death or whatever? If he knew it was for Mr. House, who he hates? If he thought that carrying it made one a traitor, like he calls you? And why? If he was so shocked and possessed by revenge upon seeing your name again on the list and learning that you weren't killed in the Divide catastrophe, did he not stake the place out until you showed up to pick up the order, or stake out the path you would have traveled to make the delivery and ambush you? Spend too long trying to find you my big butt. This would have been an elementary way to do that. This leads into the question of whether he even wants you dead in the first place. At certain parts of the story, him wanting you dead is used as a motivation to explain his behavior, like turning down the delivery. But in other parts, it's implied he doesn't care about killing you, as a way of explaining why he didn't do it sooner when he had such clear chances to. He's keeping tabs on you to get just the right amount of information for the DLC to make sense, but also trying as hard as possible not to kill you before it can take place. Let's break down each point in the he wants to kill you and he doesn't want to kill you camps. First, he turns down the platinum chip delivery as a way to set you up to get killed. He lures you to the divide and keeps talking like it's very unlikely you'll survive. He's basically obsessed with you, putting his life on hold until he can put you in the ground, but supposedly he won't pull the trigger himself when he had ample opportunity to, as we've discussed, because of Kaisar's kill no courier rule, which he has no reason to still abide by if he hates the bull. But maybe he doesn't. I really can't tell. He also seems to want the Mojave or the divide or really anything to kill you for him, and that's why he's failed to do it himself, even though he thinks killing from a distance is cowardly and criticizes you for doing so.
But you killed like NCR, like Hanlon, with mines, bombs, missiles. Killed Legion along with the bear, like a coward kills from a distance.
But he keeps saying you taught him to do that, so I guess it justifies the hypocrisy. He goes on about the fact that he could kill you, but that he's not sure that this ends that way, whatever the hell that means, or that you'd have to answer for killing each other. Again, what? My favorite is, what kind of world would this be if Courier killed Courier? Like, bro, it's just a job. Might as well say, what kind of world would this be if McDonald's employee killed McDonald's employee?
We walk the same road, carry the same colors. Can't break that by making the road red.
Bro is saying that even if I shoot a fat man at him, nothing can break the indissoluble bond between us. I've never felt so violated in my life. Anyways, this whole convoluted, he wants to kill you but can't for reasons motive is then contradicted by a bunch of other factors. For one, he needs you to get Eddie for him. Sure, he should be able to do it himself, being as legendary as he supposedly is, but he insists on waiting for you to be the one to do it. So why set you up to die by the chip? But then he turns around and says the only reason he doesn't kill you now is because the divide will probably take care of you anyways. Does he want you to successfully make the trip and bring Eddie or not? He even goes back and forth on whether he blames you for the divide or not. For example, apparently this isn't about revenge.
My history isn't revenge or hate. The road that brought us both here isn't about that. It's about the message you carried, the one in that package, whether you knew it or not. The message that one can kill a nation, can kill a symbol, and all that gather beneath its flag. I don't blame you for the divide. I blame you for what you made me see.
But in another breath, he does blame you for delivering the package, despite the fact that it was unintentional, telling you your ignorance was a choice. Given the fact that he obviously blames you while claiming not to blame you, and this contradiction at least does seem intentional, he wants you to witness him taking his revenge, even though it's supposedly not about revenge.
I'll bring the divide to your home, your nation. Let its flag burn, just like you let the divide burn. You destroyed a nation taking its first breath. A place that could have been my home. Now, I'll destroy yours.
He says this even if you aren't NCR aligned, and nukes the NCR no matter your allegiance. If you tell him you don't care if he nukes the NCR, he's completely unfazed by it.
You destroyed your own homeland, seeing a nation burn. Didn't think that would matter anymore to you.
So let me get this straight. It's not about revenge, it's about the message. But also, it's very much about revenge, and destroying your home like you destroyed his. But he also doesn't even care whether it's actually your home or not. It could be the home of your enemy and be precisely in your interest, and he'll still do it. I think it's intentional on the part of the writing that he does blame you and does want revenge, and is just posturing to seem like he's above it. But the fact that he nukes the NCR no matter what, and suddenly doesn't care at all whether you're hurt by it, kind of ruins it. In any case, hearing these dramatic lines from the end, it's kind of funny how cordial he is at other times in the DLC, giving you tips for surviving in the divide and just casually waxing poetic about history. The only way I can make sense of his seemingly conflicting motivations is that it's a mix of both. He has a love-hate relationship with you, so to speak. He wants to kill you for revenge, but he can't bring himself to because he has some sentimental attachment to you, or believes in you, that maybe you can change him, talk him out of his destructive nihilist beliefs, and that makes me feel gross. It's actually an interesting idea for a character, but the way it's executed in Ulysses is just, look, this guy is literally my stalker. I divided his honest heart. He has had a weird, unhealthy, parasocial relationship with me for years at this point, and I'm not even famous. Like, I didn't even sign up for this. I'm just some guy. With that in mind, I really have no sympathy for him, or interest in saving him from his demons. His only clear motivation is for the player to play the DLC, and the Courier's only reason to follow the broadcast is to play the DLC. All these contradictions certainly aren't helped by the way this man speaks. Took me long enough to figure out what he was saying in the first place, let alone that it didn't add up. Now, people justify this by saying English isn't his native language, so it's realistic for him to be weird and obtuse. This is a common fallacy in writing and really a lot of creative mediums, that realistic equals good. For example, a lot of people will say that characters should have flaws because it makes them realistic. Well, not really. Characters need flaws and problems because that's what creates a story in the first place. If the point is realism, why does only this part of stories have to be realistic? There's a whole lot of made up stuff in fantasy media. Why does that work? And just because a game mechanic is realistic doesn't mean it's good either. We've also seen enough examples to know that realistic graphics don't make a good game. Point is, if realism were what's fun and awesome, then we wouldn't bother with any entertainment at all. We would just live life, because that's the most realistic thing. I think a better word than realistic is logical. Any story needs to abide by logic, either the logic of our world or the story's own logic. It just needs to be consistent, especially if it invents its own logic. But logic is no issue here. It wouldn't be a stretch for Ulysses to have learned English to a native level, especially considering his intelligence stat is 10 and, well, he doesn't have an accent at all. He also hasn't been spending his time in an echo chamber of tribals, so he wouldn't be oblivious to the fact that people call it the NCR in the Legion, not the bear and the bull. Clearly, it's an intentional choice on the part of the writers, and thus on the part of Ulysses. He's knowledgeable enough that he wouldn't have to speak like this if he didn't want to, and knowledgeable enough to know that it makes it harder for others to understand him, for no good reason, which makes him pretentious. If you're gonna make a character communicate in a roundabout way, to the point where the players may have difficulty even understanding what they're trying to say, then it better serve an important enough purpose in the story to justify the trouble of decoding their cryptic speech. If that purpose isn't to make the story more logically coherent though, what is it? Well, it's because Ulysses is supposed to be all about symbols. The problem is that all the symbolism talk never results in a bigger point about anything. It's frustrating because it almost goes somewhere interesting. At certain parts in his story, he seems to have a fixation on symbols being divorced from their original meaning and how that's a really bad thing. Like when the Whitelegs braid their hair like him, without knowing each braid symbolizes something, causing Ulysses to search for a meaning in their hair which never existed in the first place. However, this point gets shattered when he himself clings to the symbol of America, its pre-war flag. He wears it on his back and it's the thing that saved his life. It's the symbol that the divide was built around, but he hates the old world ideas it represents, and thinks they shouldn't be revived in the post-apocalypse. So he's guilty of doing the same thing as the Whitelegs, divorcing a symbol from its meaning. And this contradiction is never capitalized upon to make a bigger point, it's just never addressed. For a character who's supposed to be all about symbols, you'd expect to be able to piece out how he feels about the most important one to him. But no. On that note, let's talk about how Ulysses feels about the old world in general. For one, it's his reason for criticizing the NCR and the Legion. They're trying to bring old world values into an era which, according to Ulysses, they don't belong. But the vagueness of his critiques of old world ideas are not an issue that can be hand-waved away. You can't just say all old world ideas are bad just because the old world culminated in the Great War. It's a constellation of ideas that are in direct contradiction with each other, many of which didn't contribute to the way the world ended at all. America and China's pre-war political systems are the ones that make sense to blame and dispense with, but ironically it's the old flag of America that he has an infatuation with. Does he just like the idea of a homeland or a golden age? But again, that would be divorcing the symbol from its concrete meaning, which he's supposed to be against. He criticizes House for supposedly propping up old world symbols and putting words in their mouths, but I really have no idea what he means by that. House is not an old world ghost, he is pre-war America in the flesh. A piece of America that never died. If we assume that Ulysses idolizes pre-war America, or at least the idea of it, even though that would be contradictory, then House has a much greater claim to the honor of carrying America on his back than Ulysses. And Ulysses does try to claim he carries the sleeping America. House also doesn't have any kind of obsession with reviving pre-war America, aesthetically or ideologically, or any old world society for that matter. He decidedly has an eye towards the future, not the past. You can certainly criticize House, but Ulysses just plain misunderstands him.
The city, the whole Mojave, wasn't hit by bombs. Didn't like it all. Vegas would be one of the first pieces of the old world to burn. Someone protected it. Wasn't chance, wasn't luck. Something larger. Yet they let the rest of the world suffer. And they'll do it again.
So, Mr. House shouldn't have protected the Mojave from being nuked because it wasn't equitable enough of him. Because he couldn't protect the whole world at once, he should have let the one piece of it he could protect burn. Great thinking. Another trait that comes up in relation to House is that Ulysses has this repugnance to technology that is never really explained or elaborated upon. His constant mention of Mr. House using robots and being a ghost, his hatred of Eddie, being opposed to the Brotherhood of Steel.
Not a world I want to be a part of. Going through motions until we're all smiling faces on some robot's screen. You killing the bear wouldn't prove easy. You and your machine, you survived.
She answered me on their philosophy, their way of seeing, the roads that they walk. Dead ends, empty, as if technology can solve anything. Big empty's proof where that road leads, just like the divide and all the roads that lead to it.
I don't have much to say about this other than the fact that, like the rest of his beliefs, it's frustratingly vague and never ties into a bigger picture. Oh, and it's another belief which he himself contradicts when he uses technology to try to blow up the NCR. Yeah, but again, at least that's a contradiction you can call him out on. As for the Legion, it's impossible to suss out his feelings. While he's technically opposed to them, he's sure as hell coy about it. If he has a problem with them enslaving people, he never really mentions it. In your first conversation with him, if you're Legion aligned, he doesn't criticize you for that, he criticizes you for taking the delivery job for House.
There are tales of you walking the Mojave, casting off your disguise, yet you carried that ship, determined to take it to Vegas, not Kaiser. You and that ship deserve each other. 29 fewer coins than other traders have carried, by history's mark.
And again, in your conversation at High Road, he has no qualms with you supporting Legion like he does if you support the other factions. He only criticizes you for having too much bear in you, despite being a legionary.
You struck first, not just at me, at the Legion. Or so I thought. Not sure of the history of it now. Whatever flag you follow, or followed then, either way, you got too much of the bear sickness in you to live. Divides proof of that.
Here's some other examples.
If you were a Legion, then NCR beat you. The West changed you. Farther you walk from the flag of the bull, the more West creeps into you.
So basically, in none of your conversations at Hopeville, the Divide, High Road, or the final conversation in Ulysses' temple does he criticize you for being Legion. He just says Caesar's law holds no sway in his temple, but he still considers Legion his brothers, even if misguided. The Legion kills on purpose, the NCR on accident, which is worse in his mind. His criticisms of the Legion boil down to the fact that it will fall once Caesar dies or it has nothing to war with, whichever comes first. It's a purely pragmatic concern. Any repugnance for their methods only comes through in his own personal experiences. For example, his regret for discovering Hoover Dam and killing the New Canaanites.
Kimball, Kaiser, House. You'd think that our world was that wall, cutting the Colorado. If I'd never laid eyes on it, never spoke of it.
It was like Ulysses was speaking through me. Use the night, silence, and fire to change their words to please, to screams. No need for bombs when hate will do. I asked the white legs to destroy a people with ancestry going back thousands of years. Another death of history lost to time.
It's like he keeps this part of himself compartmentalized from the ideological and political aspect of his character, or expect him to rail against the Legion as hard as he does NCR. We also see something interesting in the White Legs incident. Instead of teaching them the meaning of the braids, Ulysses just gets really upset, which is silly, so there was probably more to it than that. This quote seems to imply that the real problem is that he was confronted with his own monstrous deeds.
It was like my entire dead tribe in the firelight. Teeth grinning red in the dark. Eager corpses, blood-covered ghosts. It was like looking at the dead of my tribe, reborn as ghosts. Hateful, hungry, bowing to Caesar. Another history. Gone. Carried by me alone.
But again, it only seems to imply. The last thing he says really undercuts this as an admission of regret or guilt. Another history gone, carried by me alone. It puts the emphasis on what was done to him, not what he's done to others. But if he hasn't definitively and vehemently repented of his actions, not just of a Legion as a concept or a faction, but his personal wrongdoing, then that seriously undermines any kind of moral or philosophical judgment he's trying to mete out about what's right and wrong, and all the whining he does at the Courier for their actions. I don't think it would be wrong or impossible to write a Legion sympathetic character who makes legitimate critiques of the player. He's just very inconsistent about it to the point where nothing can be gleaned gleaned from his perspective. I mean, it's not even clear why he stopped serving the Legion when he did, which is a huge issue. That's a defining aspect of his character, being a former legionary. You'd expect the former part to get explained. In fact, you can ask him about it, but he just gets offended and proceeds to go on his default spiel about how you destroyed the Divide.
Even after the road you've walked, you only see a traitor before you.
And while it's clear that Ulysses wasn't happy about his tribe's betrayal,
It's where my tribe was taken, where another history was put to the blade, lesson taught. It is where we realize Wolpus did not approach us as equals.
what isn't clear is why he remained loyal to the Legion after that in the first place. Was it out of genuine belief in the faction? It wasn't just out of fear of what would happen if he deserted. He was clearly loyal to them at some point, and Ulysses could have skipped town on them whenever he wanted if he's so strong. So, since he was loyal to them, what did he see in them? And what ruined that image for him? I think his disillusionment would have been a pretty interesting plot point, but I guess I just must be insane. As far as why his character might have turned out all garbled like this, I think it has something to do with Avalon's design goal of making him your nemesis. Ulysses isn't intended to mirror the player. He was just intended to act as a nemesis. It's one thing to write him to be your nemesis in the sense of being a mortal threat to you. This is fine, Benny is like this. But making him your ideological nemesis is another thing entirely. In the rest of the game, it's for the player to decide who their political enemies and allies are. It's in the eye of the beholder. Someone being your ideological nemesis depends on what you believe. To fix this issue, they just make Ulysses disagree with you no matter what you believe, which makes the political stuff seem like a sideshow to whatever the actual conflict is. If he disagrees with you no matter what you believe, that would imply it has nothing to do with the beliefs and everything to do with you, but this can't be the case. Politics are clearly supposed to be the central focus of the story, which would imply that he does have some kind of overarching belief system, which is never explained, that makes sense of how he hates the Legion, NCR, and House, and simultaneously thinks there's nothing you could possibly believe in if you don't choose any of them. Wait, doesn't that just put you in the same boat as him? Someone who's chosen none of the factions? Wouldn't that imply he doesn't believe in anything? That's really funny. The only way to ensure that he's your ideological nemesis is for his beliefs to be totally unclear. So maybe that's why he is the way he is. But without any clear beliefs for you to butt up against, he falls flat as a nemesis. Well, there is one clear belief you guys fight over in the ending, whether destruction is the answer. Should we just keep blowing up bad societies and re-rolling the dice until a good one spontaneously manifests itself? But if this was the only contention all along, then what was all that political blabbering along the way for? Cause bro does a lot of whining. Everything he says about House and NCR, what was all that for? While we're on the subject, let's talk about the ending. As I've gone over, part of the issue with having Ulysses be a mouthpiece for critiques about anyone or anything is we don't know what he actually values. If old world ideas are not the answer, whatever he actually means by old world ideas, since that's quite the broad umbrella, then what are? The DLC sidesteps the issue of specifying this by never clarifying what the divide actually looked like. You'd think with how much Ulysses gushes about it, he'd let slip on at least one occasion just what exactly he likes so much about it, but alas, he doesn't. Of course, this could be an intentional decision. Leave it vague because the point of the divide is that Ulysses only knew an idealized version of it. And had it been given the time to develop, it would have manifested flaws just like every other society. As Avalon says, unfortunately, Ulysses latched onto some distant imagery of what the Divide/America might have been, so he doesn't have all the facts. This could have been developed into a bigger message about how it's not the society that makes things good, but the people that make the society good. And if you care about maintaining things, that's a continual uphill battle. And actually, the ending where you talk Ulysses down has you telling him that you can make the Mojave good since you made the Divide good. But this is only half of the equation. Rather than capitalizing upon the vagueness of Ulysses' beliefs, it makes them completely pointless. The inclusion of the politics would need to build up to the explicit conclusion that they were just a distraction for this to work, and that his Puritanism isn't helpful. The other glaring issue is that your line saying I can make the Mojave good since I made the Divide good doesn't make sense because you clearly don't care about the Divide, and anything you did for it was completely accidental. If it was an intentional effort on your part to carve out a community, you would have remembered the darn place. And just like you created it on accident, you destroyed it on accident. Since the message puts the power in the hands of the individual, it's even more frustrating that he never has to confront his own personal failings. Ulysses never has to face the fact that he's part of the reason the Mojave is broken. He's the reason for the war between the bear and the bull, for other promising communities like the New Canaanites getting destroyed. He's so focused on fixing it, but never realizes what he did to ruin it in the first place. It's such a clear thematic opportunity that is completely missed, not because you can't convince him of it, but because you can't even bring it up to him. Ulysses has no experience building or maintaining a community of any sort on any scale. It is making prescriptions for the entire Mojave. Without even knowing what he actually wants or what his ideal society would look like, he just wants to tear everything down. He dresses up his pathological desire for revenge against you and the world in a political coat of paint, and when he's made to see a sliver of reason, the onus is on you to fix things. He just gives up his political aspirations entirely, which is probably for the best. By the way, all that stuff about you being culpable for meddling, for doing things on accident because ignorance is actually choice, etc., doesn't tie in at all thematically with this ending. The final choice to blow up the NCR or the Legion is redundant. You already get to decide which faction takes control over the Mojave through the main story. It's a leftover idea from Van Buren that makes no sense here. If the big important theme of this DLC was supposed to be that one person can make or break a nation, well, the main story already drives that message home, and way more effectively too. The missiles in Lonesome Road are kinda, inconsequential. The DLC literally invents new places for them to hit that weren't present on the map before. The NCR and Legion carry on like nothing happened. The geopolitical situation isn't impacted whatsoever. Worse yet, you can still maintain cordial relations with either faction after nuking them, which is just insane to me. Lonesome Road is not only broken in itself, but retroactively destroys the believability of the base game's factions. Chris Avellin said, "I wanted to nuke the Fallout world to reset things. NCR is getting a bit big and it's making things too civilized. Lonesome Road was a way of resetting the culture clock." So that's another reason why the ending is what it is. This really is just a difference of opinion, but Fallout isn't about the rubble to me. It's about what emerges from it. The societies and factions that emerge and the fact that they don't have to be limited by the world we know. What is the Fallout IP if not the factions? Also, the fact that the successful missile launch is kinda supposed to be the canon ending just throws all that analysis we did of the message straight out the window. If Ulysses' goal is revenge, he would take more effective revenge by just nuking the Mojave, which the player cares about no matter their allegiance. But obviously this would interfere with the base game too much, making it impossible. There's a problem here, trying to get him to destroy something that matters to you, but him being unable to destroy anything of actual importance, lest it interfere with the main game. What should have been done is what was done with Dead Money, where you can get an ending that just ends the game. That way you can have serious consequences, but then go back to the main timeline and the show goes on. But they wouldn't have done that because your encounter with Ulysses is kind of supposed to be your last stop before the final battle at Hoover Dam. Also, it didn't occur to me for the longest time, but it's kind of weird how the player is forced to be antagonistic with Ulysses. Yes, I know there's a peaceful ending where you talk him down from launching the missiles, but why can't you just, agree with him? Why can't you launch the missiles together? Actually, you can convince him that you're gonna save the Mojave and nuking it isn't necessary, and then still launch the missiles yourself, and he has nothing to say about that, other than remarking on the geopolitical consequences. If I were him, I don't know, you just rizzed me up, talked me down from the ledge just to fire the missiles anyways? Am I a joke to you? After all this, it's hard to tell how much of Ulysses' hypocrisy and contradictory nature is intentional versus unintentional. Now, let me clarify that I understand the difference between a character being bad and the writing of a character being bad, since this point frequently gets brought up in discussions about Ulysses. Of course, there are all sorts of loathsome characters in media that are extremely well written, because the point is that they're supposed to be wrong and evil. But by serving that role, antagonists should ultimately illustrate a greater point for the audience to consider, or at least effectively force the protagonist to learn and grow. Writing a character with merely the intention of making them as hateable as possible, just to give the audience a punching bag and make the moment where they're killed more satisfying, is technically valid, but kinda wasted potential. And it seems pretty clear that Ulysses wasn't meant to be that kind of character. So I'm forced to confront the fact that he's extremely annoying and nonsensical to me, but he wasn't supposed to be, which seems like a failure of the writing. Ulysses was definitely supposed to be wrong about certain things. I mean, take Chris Avellon's word for it, and those things you could point out to him if your speech is high enough, but he has a bunch of other contradictions which seem to me to be unintentional, considering you could never call him out on them, and they never get woven into a cohesive narrative about him. One that is clearly intentional is him calling you cowardly for blowing up the divide, tilling from a distance, and you can call him out on doing the same thing. The Courier says, "There is no honor in murder from a distance, NCR or Legion. You know this from the divide." And Ulysses' response is, "History has proven this, our history." But then there's others, such as, "I'm mad about my community being destroyed on accident, even though I destroyed others' communities on purpose, and am about to do it again. I'm all about the failures of the old world, so you know what? Let me repeat its absolute worst mistake." So, what are we supposed to take away from this DLC? Let's take what I feel is New Vegas' best written DLC as an example. With Joshua Graham, I can easily sum up the meaning of his character. He's a former legionary who repents of his evil ways and finds God, only to use his Christianity to justify more bloodshed in the form of revenge. Graham needs to learn to have mercy and forgive others for their wrongdoing, like Christ forgave him after all his wrongdoing. But after dozens of hours spent working on this video, I really couldn't tell you a clear message that Lonesome Road amounts to. Or at least, I couldn't do it in good faith, without ignoring all the pieces that contradict it, that hamper its delivery. Let's take a look at Chris Avellon's intentions with Ulysses. Ulysses isn't intended to mirror the player, he was just intended to act as a nemesis. And while he's been wounded, he's not crazy. Both the NCR and the Legion are embodying two political principles that have shown to fail the world in the past, and are currently failing the world as they exist. The fact that they even exist is a testament that history is repeating, and it's the wrong lessons. Best thing? Take them out now, give room for a new idea. The idea and the power wouldn't have occurred to Ulysses without the player's intervention. Unfortunately, Ulysses latched on to some distant imagery of what the divide or America might have been, so he doesn't have all the facts. Still, I don't really understand the last thing he said, that Ulysses latched onto some distant imagery of what the divide or America might have been. Again, it seems to imply that he does idealize America, but that contradicts everything else he says about the old world, and narratively, it doesn't result in any bigger point. Anyways, from this quote, we can gather that Ulysses is supposed to be reasonable. He's supposed to be rational, but the best reading I can make of his character isn't in line with this at all. In short, that's not what was intended. The only way I can make sense of him is by reading him as a guilty former legionary like Graham. But unlike Graham, he suppresses this guilt. He shirks responsibility. He doesn't seek repentance. Instead of rectifying his personal wrongdoing, he goes insane and projects his guilt onto the world, onto you. The pseudo-intellectual nonsense is an afterthought to justify his base desires. This take is inspired by a Reddit post I found that was the first one I read where it felt like it actually made some kind of sense. He is unable to face everything he's done, the destruction of New Canaan and talking to Kaisar about the Hoover Dam. In that regard, he's similar to Joshua Graham, but while Joshua understands the magnitude of his actions and all the evil he has done and faces it, Ulysses is unable to do that. The both of them are their worst enemy, but in different ways. While in Joshua's case it's his own destructive nature, Ulysses on the other hand has fed upon his own lies to protect himself from his actions. I think Ulysses is largely projecting onto the Courier. It's his way of confronting his own demons. The Courier is like a mirror for him, the person with whom he feels closest in terms of life and history. The way I know that this is not intentional is that Avellon said he's not intended to mirror or reflect the player. I watched and read all this stuff about how deep and great of a character he is, or the person either reads meanings in that were completely not there, like him being an anarcho-communist of all things, or just pointed to details that are not meaningful in themselves, or dispense with important parts of his character to spin a narrative. People don't get how damaged he is. Okay, well, no matter how convincingly traumatized and broken of a man you write, you have to do something with that. It's a shame that well-written pieces of his backstory go to waste like that, or that he's a mirror or reflection of the Courier. Okay, and besides that not being true, that's just a neat thing. What does the DLC actually utilize that to say? Anyways, on this Reddit user's reading of things, Do you think anyone came away from the DLC with that message, with that understanding? Look, I'm the last person to judge a work of art based on how it's received by the public, since I like all kinds of repugnant garbage. But I don't think it means nothing that most people just glean the bear bull meme from it. A pretty common reading I found, even among people that really like and praise this character, is that Ulysses is just straight up mentally ill. I believe he just wants to see NCR destroyed because apparently the Courier unintentionally destroyed Hopeville with some device he took from the West. He's a madman obsessed with you, the Courier, and with NCR. This right here is the bottom line. Ulysses is not rational, and none of his professed motivations, other than his obsession with the Courier, can stand up to scrutiny. Now that I agree with wholeheartedly. The issue is that Avalon does not. This is commonly relied on to explain the contradictions in his behavior and all the plot holes. He's crazy and needs to read meaning into everything that happens, even accidents. Maybe he's got you mistaken for another person. Maybe he even set off the explosions in the divide himself and is projecting it onto you. But again, Avalon said that he isn't crazy. And that quote from earlier also scratches out the possibility that he's supposed to be a pompous pseudo-intellectual that gets on your nerves. Clearly, there's supposed to be things he gets right, something to what he's saying, but it just never lands. Let's take a step back and look at Obsidian's design goals. See maybe where things went wrong. Ulysses is a nemesis, a foil and a sounding board, yes. Also, for want of a better definition, he's designed to ego stroke the player. He's clearly one of the legendary figures in the DLC, and the fact that he's so focused on your player character to the absence of almost everything else in the world is intended to make the player feel important, feel cool, and get the sense that they matter. Many of the things that Ulysses says throughout the DLCs are intended to reinforce how capable the player is. Elijah's gone to the CR Madre. Someone tougher, stronger is going to kill him if the Madre doesn't. It's supposed to be an indirect compliment to you. People on the forums got excited once they realized that someone was specifically looking for their player, and seeing a legendary figure consider their courier important enough to follow to the ends of the earth makes the player's journey all the stronger, in my opinion. Setting out to ego stroke the player is like setting out to make the audience cry, in my opinion. Writers will sometimes try to force a bunch of things that don't make sense into a scene just to ham it up and make it more emotional, and this completely backfires. They break the logic of the story to try and make me care about it more, when breaking the logic makes me not care at all. When you prioritize things above the story making sense, you're gonna slip up and create plot holes. That's 100% what happened with Ulysses. He doesn't stroke my ego because he feels like a stupid idiot rather than a formidable opponent. He has no clear motivations and his behavior is contradictory. He doesn't pursue his goals, supposing he even has any, even though he's supposed to be this legendary figure with 10 in every special stat. Instead, he waits around for me to show up so he can whine at me. He taps his fingers together all tsundere about killing me, and this is supposed to make me feel important? It just makes him feel lame. To put it simply, wishy-washy motivations and behavior, which are needed to facilitate the contrived setup of the DLC, undermine his status as a legendary figure, which defeats the purpose of doing this contrived setup to ego stroke the player in the first place. He also has the effect of trivializing all of my accomplishments. Wow, this idiot did everything I did, went everywhere I went. Guess I'm not that impressive after all. Like, this guy is my nemesis? Dang. I suck. Effective ego stroking in games is more about responding to the player's agency, their choices, but a big part of Ulysses' response is to something you as the player didn't do, delivering the package that blew up the divide. Part of the reason this DLC may have gotten muddied up is that it tries to repurpose older material. For one, the idea of redirecting nukes comes from Van Buren's intended ending. Van Buren being the original version of Fallout 4 that was supposed to be developed by Black Isle, the original studio behind Fallout. There, the missile launch can't be prevented altogether, so you have to choose which locations will be destroyed. But that idea doesn't work here because it's redundant. We already got to choose between factions. Another thing is that Ulysses was originally created as a companion, but was scrapped because he had too much dialogue. Truly a yapper.
What was the issue with Ulysses as a companion? His dialogue, his recorded dialogue was so big it literally wouldn't fit on the disc. I don't remember how many lines it was. It was like Cass was our second biggest companion after Ulysses, and then Ulysses was like much more than her, and literally just wouldn't fit.
Another important goal with him was the Legion stuff. As Chris Avallone explained, he had to be a Legion sympathetic character and explain Legion backstory elements, since there wasn't much Legion support in the companions. I definitely agree with this design goal, but of course, we see it get overwritten in the DLC. Is he still Legion sympathetic or not? Was he ever genuinely sympathetic to them? Why? What did he see in them? We never get the answers. With all this in mind, we can attempt to tease apart the disparate elements of his character that are in conflict with each other. There are three main elements. The first is the original one, the Legion sympathetic companion, the conservative, to put it simply. He values old world American symbols and ideas, evident in his belief in the Legion only being curtailed by the fact that Caesar will eventually die, causing a Legion to become headless and fall apart, and that a warring, expansionist nation will fall once it has nothing to conquer. This is something he sees as bad, because the order the Legion brings to the wasteland is good in his eyes. He never makes any negative comment about the morality and practice by the Legion or how it's socially organized. This one dislikes the NCR for how disorderly it is, corrupt, divided against itself, not rigorous enough to enforce its laws. The second part is the revolutionary, who believes that completely destroying every remnant of what once was, including the factions mimicking old world concepts, is the solution that can bring about a utopian society, such as the unspecified pre-nuke detonation divide. This Ulysses thinks that universal destruction and starting from scratch is the only way to truly rid civilization from the implied to be bad old world heritage. This must be the case, otherwise he'd just side with House, who not only is literally from the old world, but is an undying autocrat, a perfect fit for the first Ulysses' wishes. The third part is the stalker, gratuitously obsessed with you, particularly because of how you're delivering packages made the divide function as a society. Then, once you delivered the device, the stalker Ulysses enters into a love-hate obsessive relationship with you, because the same thing he arbitrarily chose to glorify as the thing which built a nation is now accidentally responsible for destroying it. He was also inspired by this action in a way that he could take things into his own hands. From here, we can try to rewrite the DLC to be a bit more cohesive. For starters, if it were up to me, he wouldn't have any personal connection to you to begin with. The idea of you having a delineated backstory just comes into conflict with this kind of RPG in my opinion. It's an issue to try to assign background lore to the players when they don't have amnesia, because a dissonance will be created where they don't know something their character would reasonably know about themselves. He also doesn't feel like my nemesis because he doesn't actually have anything to do with me. I know it sounds silly, but really, the game has to repeatedly tell me how important he is to me, how tied we are to each other. It can't show it because in actuality, he isn't. None of his involvement with me has anything to do with my choices as the player. His character should also just be stripped back to the conservative element. The Stalker makes no sense and undercuts his legendary status. He doesn't feel big and important if he's fixated on a nobody like me. If you remember correctly, he was stalking me before I was important whatsoever, just an average courier. That's weird. He should play hard to get in a manner of speaking. And the revolutionary is just a direct contradiction to the conservative, which muddies up his views on the old world and symbols. One has got to go, and considering he was intended to drive more serious consideration of the Legion by players, a design goal I definitely find interesting, we should stick with that direction. When I look at certain parts of his character, like his fixation on there being strength and symbols, his preference for the Legion's cruelty over the NCR's weakness and corruption, his view of explosives as cowardly, and his implied view of Vegas as degenerate, my natural inclination is to make him a sort of super legionary. Obviously, we'll stick with the environment of the divide, which I actually like. Obsidian succeeded at making it feel like the end with how eerie and barren it is, and I enjoyed the gameplay. Here's what we'll do, okay? Let's remove the divide backstory. It'll still have the tunnelers, but instead of them incidentally coming about through radiation, maybe they were genetically engineered for military purposes, and then maybe irradiated some more on top of that. There's no pre-existing connection between you two. As for Ulysses, he initially believes in the Legion due to his faith in the inevitability of its victory by military domination, but he deserts it after their first defeat at Hoover Dam. He still believes in the might is right stuff, but he thinks the Legion has failed according to that standard. He wants to establish his own total military domination in the Mojave, seeing as the Legion has already failed in his eyes. Other than being against the NCR for obvious reasons, he's against House because House has to schmooze with NCR cells cells in order to stick around. He doesn't have the strength to maintain a stranglehold without that. So he goes to the deadliest places searching for things that are strong, and this is why he stops by the Big Empty. He eventually comes to the Divide and finds what he was looking for, creatures that survived even the nukes. He figures out how to weaponize them. Seeing as they originally did come about from military experimentation, there is a way of controlling them, maybe with sound waves since they're blind, and he starts building his army. He does an emergency alert system type transmission saying that China has attacked and the nukes in the stockpile are ready to be used as a way to lure people to the Divide to test his army against. In reality, there are no nukes in some stockpile. The NCR and Legion make attempts to invade, but they die upon entry. Again, he truly believes in Caesar's Hegelian dialectics shtick and thinks that whether he gets defeated or comes out on top, the inevitable force will emerge from it. Whatever opponent that defeats him will be strengthened by the encounter. We actually see a bit of this in the actual DLC with what Ulysses says if you tell him you killed Caesar.
Caesar would be history's hypocrite if he was angry about what happened. I'm not one for it either. Seems you just proved his philosophy to him. If he'd been stronger, he'd be alive, and we wouldn't be talking. Done with blame. And Caesar was big on strength making right. Seems to me you proved that philosophy to him. If he was too weak to stop you, too weak to defend himself, then he needed to die with his beliefs.
It's kind of like Linnaeus maxing. He wants to find or become the real version of the myth. He strengthens the Legion's ideal to where you can't critique it on the grounds that it isn't as strong as it claims or aspires to be. You have to contend with might is right directly. The credits that were spent teasing Ulysses could have been spent teasing the looming threat of the Divide, that even if a faction comes out on top, they still got this place to worry about. So then you show up. Ulysses has these logs scattered throughout the Divide from his original trek through it. He recorded them because there was a very real possibility of him dying and his thoughts dying with him. You're the only one who can make it through and finally meet him when you can interrogate his beliefs, and then you have a final boss battle with him. Like Frank Horgan blowing up the oil rig, he self-destructs his army when you defeat him, because it would probably be too OP if the player got control over the tunnelers. It works much better as a way to ego stroke the player. When he talks about his plan to bring about the inevitable force in his logs, that's an indirect compliment to you, and it also works much better as a way to provide a nemesis for the player regardless of their beliefs, because he doesn't disagree with anything in particular as much as he requires you to prove your ability to act it out, whatever it is you believe. Obviously, all my critiques are a matter of taste. I would love to hear dissenting opinions in the comments below. I know a lot of people love Lonesome Road, so I'm really curious to hear why. What's the coherent message you took away from it? And how do you reconcile it with Ulysses' inconsistent and erratic character? Do you think we should just ignore what Avalon has said, death of the author and all that? And please no personal attacks on any of the people involved in making the DLC in the comments. I know I mentioned Chris Avalon a lot, but my intention in doing so wasn't to single him out and blame him for everything wrong in the world. It's just that he's been the guy to clarify a lot of the plot points. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing to let me know you want more. This is my first video on this channel, but I got plenty more ideas where this came from, or you can let me know what you want to see in the comments. Alright, peace.